what is the difference between event bubbling and event capturing in JavaScript. So to explain this, I've created just a basic HTML file. We've got a body tag, and then inside there we've got a div. Inside that div we have another div, and then another div, and then we have a button at the end, at the leaf. I've also added some styles to this, so just to make it easier to see on the screen, but I've hidden them for now just because you don't really need to see them. Let's have a look at what this actually looks like on the screen. And here you go. So we've got the body, and then the first, the second, the third, the fourth, and then the button here, which is click me. Okay, so what actually happens when I click the button, click me? Let me explain that with a few slides. So this is the DOM representation of that HTML which I just showed you. We have, the root level window, then document, and then we have the body, the first, the second, the third, the fourth div, and then we have the button at the very end of that tree, that leaf. Now we clicked on the button. So you might think the first thing that happens is that the button fires an event, and that event goes up the stack, up the tree to the window object. But that's actually wrong. In fact, what happens is that the event is fired by the root object, by the window object, and travels directly down the tree to the button. The button is what we call the target. And although the event, goes to the target, it also touches every single parent of the button on the way down. So if you had added event listeners to the button, to the fourth, the third, the second, the first, the body, the document, the window, if you had added event listeners for the click event on each of those elements, all of those listeners would have been called. Now, even when it reaches the bottom, it doesn't stop. It carries on back up the stack to the window, to the root again. It doesn't matter where you click on a page, the event always starts from the root, goes to the target, and then back up to the root again. These two different arrows I'm showing you, these are called phases. The part that goes from the root to the target, this is called the event capturing phase, or sometimes called phase 1. The part that goes from the target to the root, this is called the event bubbling phase, or phase 2. So all the elements on the event's path will get notified twice when an event is fired. Now you might be asking the question, how come you haven't seen evidence of that in your code? If what I'm saying is right, then every event listener you've added to your code would get called twice, once in the event capturing phase and once in the event bubbling phase. But I'm betting that you've never seen an example where your event listener gets called twice. For you, it probably only gets called once. Now, the answer is that when you add an event listener, you can choose which phase you want it to listen to. You can add an event listener which listens to events as they travel down the event capturing phase, or you can add an event listener which listens to events as it comes back up the event bubbling phase. If you don't specify which phase you want to listen to, by default, it listens to the event bubbling phase. So if you've never dealt with this in the past, all you've been doing is adding event listeners to the event bubbling phase. You've never touched the event capturing phase. Now let me show you how this works with some code. So going back into our HTML document here, you can see at the bottom I've actually got a script tag which I've hidden. I hid before. Now I'm going to show you it. And in this script tag, what I'm doing is I'm getting all of the elements which have the class item, which all of these elements do have the class item. I'm then looping through each of those elements, and I'm then adding an event listener to that element, to the click event. Now for the event listener, the first parameter is the name of the event we want to listen to, or the type of the event we want to listen to. So I'm saying I want to listen to click events. And then it's the function that gets called when that event listener is fired. And then the last parameter, this parameter here, is a Boolean that defines whether you want to be listening on the capturing phase or on the bubbling phase. Now, if you don't specify this, which you probably never have specified it, if you don't specify that, it's going to be the bubbling phase. If you do specify it and it's false, that's the bubbling phase. If it's true, it's the capturing phase. So what I'm doing here is via JavaScript, I'm adding event listeners to each of these items. Now you might also see some code here. This is a closure. Why do you think I'm adding a closure here? I'm adding a closure here so that when I look for the item and print out the item here, it's actually going to print out the right item. Now, if you can't remember or are not sure what I'm talking about here, go back and watch the lecture on closures. Because really, this is an exact scenario. This is exactly the time we would want to use closures to solve a specific problem. So if you're not sure, go back and watch that lecture on closures. And so what happens when the event listener gets fired is we just log it to the console. So let me show you with the application again, but this time I'm going to open up the console at the bottom. And actually, let me open it to the right. Okay, give it some space. Refresh the page. Here we go. Okay. So watch what happens when I click on the button. So just to remind you what it's printing out in the console log the actual item upon which we're adding the event listener and the event object itself. We have added event listeners which listen to the bubbling phase, so the events that are getting called on the way back up the tree. So from the button, the third, the second, the first, body, and then HTML, document, and window. Let's see what happens when we change that to listen to the capturing phase. So to change that to listen to the capturing phase, we just change this boolean, this final parameter, to true. And now if we go back into this page, refresh, and now let me click on click me, you can see it's now coming from the body, the first, the second, the third, the fourth. So we're listening to the events as they're coming down from the root to the target on the capturing phase now. So that's it. That's the difference between event bubbling and event capturing. So to summarize, when you click on something, there's actually two phases that event travels through. The first phase is the capturing phase, and the event travels from the root to the target. The second phase is the bubbling phase, where the event travels from the target back up to the root. You can add event listeners which listen to those two phases independently. The last parameter to that event listener is a boolean. If you set true, it listens for events on the capturing phase. If you set false, it listens to the events on the bubbling phase. And if you don't specify anything at all, it defaults to false. So by default, you would always listen to the event bubbling phase.